Herzlich willkommen in der Mediathek. Ich bin Liane und ich lese euch heute die Geschichte von Herrn Hase und Frau Bär in Englisch vor. Deshalb geht es jetzt in Englisch weiter. Hello everyone, welcome to the Mediathek. I'm Liane and I'm glad that you are joining my reading the picture book of Mr. Rabbit and Mrs. Bear. The story was written by Christa Kenter and illustrated by Frau The publisher is Nord-Süd and the translation of the book was made by Bilibri. And now, are you ready for the story? Then let's see what happens. Mr. Rabbit and Mrs. Bear. One day, Mr. Rabbit discovers an abandoned house right in the middle of the woods, a bit old and crooked, but otherwise quite charming. I think I'll move in here, says Mr. Rabbit happily. But he soon realizes that the house is much too big for one lone rabbit. And so he nails a sign to the post in the front of the house. Beautiful apartment for rent, 2nd floor. The very next day, there is a heavy knock on the door. Mrs. Bear is standing outside. Pretty little house, she rumbles, a bit small. I could learn to love it, so. Is the apartment still available, Mr. Rabbit? Mr. Rabbit looks way up to Mrs. Bear. Yes, it is. But you see, I was thinking of a smaller housemaid, a hamster perhaps, or a turtle. Mrs. Bear laughs. Hamster, turtle, how boring. You need someone who will be more fun, Mr. Rabbit, someone like me. Mr. Rabbit thinks it over. Then he sighs. Well, okay, Mrs. Bear, we can give it a try. But no trampling up and down the stairs. And you must keep everything tidy. And wash the windows every Saturday. Anything else? Asks Mrs. Bear as she trembles up the stairs to the 2nd floor. At first, things go quite well, but already by the 2nd week, Mrs. Bear forgets to wash the windows. What for? She thinks. When it rains, they'll just get wet again, and it's so cozy in bed. Mrs. Bear loves to sleep in, you see, and doesn't get up until almost noon. When she spreads honey on 2 bread rolls, hums a cheerful song about the honeybees and calls downstairs, Done with the newspaper, Mr. Rabbit? And when Miss Bear is done reading the paper and has gotten everything around her sticky with honey, she takes a nap. Mr. Rabbit's day begins quite differently. He hops out of the bed at 6 o'clock in the morning, munches 2 carrots, sweeps the kitchen, cleans up the apartment, dusts, smooths out the bed covers, and waters the geranium. Then he sits down in his armchair and contemplates his work with satisfaction. Every Friday, Mr. Rabbit bakes a carrot cake. Mrs. Bear sticks her nose in the air and sniffs. What a wonderful smell! Without knocking, she steps into Mr. Rabbit's kitchen. Let me have a taste, Mr. Rabbit. It's the same thing every Friday, Mrs. Bear, scolds Mr. Rabbit. Why don't you bake a cake yourself for a change? Well, that's not very nice of you, Mr. Rabbit, says Mrs. Bear. You don't want me to starve, do you? This can't go on, thinks Mr. Rabbit. That evening in bed, she always wants something from me, but doesn't ever do anything herself. She storms around until my ears hurt. She leaves crumbs all over the place, and her windows are so dirty that you can't even see through them. Mr. Rabbit is so upset that he can hardly sleep. Even carrots don't taste good anymore, and he's getting thinner and thinner. "Is everything okay, Mr. Rabbit?" Miss Bear asks one day. "Are you sick?" "No," says Mr. Rabbit, and he grits his teeth. "Relax and take it easy," says Mrs. Bear, and she lies down under the apple tree. "I've got to get rid of her," Mr. Rabbit decides. And then everything goes even worse. One evening, Mr. Rabbit hears a terrible trembling on the stairs. He opens the door a crack and peers out. Lot of beer paws are stomping up the stairs. "More beers," groans Mr. Rabbit. "No rabbit can tolerate this." Within minutes, music blasts through the entire house. Furious, Mr. Rabbit runs up to Mrs. Bear's apartment. The whole living room is full of bears. 2 are playing the accordion, 2 are scratching away at the violin, and 1 is blowing a trumpet. And in the middle is Miss Bear dancing wildly. "I'm so glad you've come, Mr. Rabbit," she calls out. "Come on, let's dance." Before Mr. Rabbit can say a word, Miss Bear twirls him through the air. Then they take a short break, and Mrs. Bear spreads honey on lots and lots of bread rolls. "Meet my brothers," she says to Mr. Rabbit. With their cheeks full, the Bear brothers smile and stretch out their sticky pawns to Mr. Rabbit. And then the party continues with music, dancing, and honey rolls. Mr. Rabbit never gets a break. He dances until he can hardly stand, and he's so tired that he can't keep his eyes open. "Poor Mr. Rabbit," says Mrs. Bear. "It was a little too much for him." She snatches him up in her arms and carries him downstairs to his bed. "It's so terribly uncomfortable here," Mrs. Bear says, amazed, and she brings 2 fluffy pillows from her apartment. Mr. Rabbit hasn't felt this good in a long time. He burrows deep into the pillows. They are so warm and soft, and they smell a little bit like Mrs. Bear. "Strange," thinks Mr. Rabbit. It was actually really cozy at Mrs. Bear's despite the untidiness. And so long since he last danced. And then he falls asleep, excused and happy. The next day, Mr. Rabbit gets up early, sits down at the kitchen table and writes a letter. "Dear Mrs. Bear, the music was terribly loud yesterday, but dancing with you wasn't half bad. You may invite your brothers again sometime, but only if they wash their sticky paws. Best regards, Mr. Rabbit. P.S. May I keep these fluffy pillows?" In the evening, Mr. Rabbit knocks on Mr. Bear's door. I thought maybe you could use some help cleaning up after such a big party," he suggests carefully. "Together it'll be easier." "Oh, don't work so hard. Relax and take it easy," says Mrs. Bear and smiles. "Well, how about just cleaning the windows, Mrs. Bear?" Mr. Rabbit eagerly adds. "You can't even see through them anymore." Mrs. Bear huffs and puffs and washes the windows with her huge paws. Suddenly she cries out in joy, "How about that, Mr. Rabbit? I can see the moon again, and the stars, and look, a bed, and over there on the pine tree, isn't that Miss Owl? How exciting!" Mr. Rabbit and Miss Bear stand behind the freshly cleaned window pane and look at the moon and the stars. Suddenly Miss Bear says, "Boy, I'd sure love some honey rolls. Right now, you too, Mr. Rabbit? and maybe a little dance afterwards. If you insist, Mrs. Bear, says Mr. Rabbit, and he scratches the back of his ear. That was the story of Mr. Rabbit and Mrs. Bear. I hope you enjoyed it and think about what Miss Bears said. Relax and take it easy. Now it's time to say goodbye for me, and I hope you have a nice day, stay safe, and bye-bye. Until the next time.